A very good afternoon to all. In this first panel discussion to kickstart the Enterprise Asia segment of Unitize 2020, we have invited various key leaders driving ecosystem development efforts in Asia. Let me first introduce our esteemed panel's members today. Firstly, we have Alan, the Asia Pacific Head of Blockchain Competency Center for IBM, Veronica, the Director of Next Generation Platforms at IMDA Singapore, a Singapore government agency, Eric, the Chief Architect of Open Platform at WeBank. But before we begin, maybe we can have a short introduction by each of the panelists. We can start with Alan for this.
All right, thanks, Ming, and really great to have this opportunity to talk about the work that we do and really exchange opinions and views with my fellow panelists. What I've been really focusing on last couple of years is looking at the adoption of blockchain as a technology, starting from initial phase where we've looked at applying blockchain really outside the cryptocurrency space, looking at what else it can do, and quite encouraged to see its development from some of the initial ideas and concepts to where it is now in terms of some of these projects and initiatives come to fruition into actual pilots and productions, and some have grown out to be full-fledged companies on their own and full-fledged networks. So really excited about the work that I had the opportunity to be part of together with the rest of my company, but also more importantly, I think the rest of the ecosystem. So really encourage and look forward to see how this space evolves.
Thank you. Veronica?
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. I'm from the Infocom Media Development Agency, IMDA. This is a government agency in Singapore that is overseeing the digital economy strategy for Singapore. So naturally, in any areas of technology and digital applications of technology, this would be something we would be keen on. Personally, for myself, I come from the technology and infrastructure group. So within the organization, we tend to look at the so-called newer and upcoming emerging technologies, of which blockchain is one of them. Been in this space for about 2+ years now and have seen tremendous growth of blockchain applications, particularly in interest and take-up by enterprises. So clearly an exciting space to be in. Looking forward to working with the rest to understand more and unravel more about blockchain applications, particularly for enterprises.
And last but not least, Eric.
Thank you, Ming. Hi, everyone. I'm Eric. So I'm from WeBank. So WeBank actually is a digital bank in China. And then one of the focus that we have is really on technology. So we have AI, blockchain, cloud computing, as well as big data. So when I joined the WeBank, right, I was excited to see how WeBank actually treats technology, how important it is, especially on blockchain. So at that time when I joined WeBank, a lot of focus were on Bitcoins, not talking about investment. But when I joined WeBank, it's all about enterprise, how do we use blockchain. So I'm glad to be here talking about how the future will be kind of changed, reformed with the technology blockchain. Thank you.
Amazing. I think you guys have seen a short introduction of the panelists, especially for guys that are outside of Asia that haven't met Eric, Veronica, and Alan. Today, you'll be listening to more of their insights. So Asia as a whole has been one key focus area for blockchain development. Within the last 10 months, there have been a greater push by countries such as China, South Korea, and Singapore to drive more blockchain developments. And today, we hope to get some insights on the role that Asia will play in the future of blockchain. So let's start with Alan. I mean, through your work at IBM, you have been working with companies all across the globe. What are your thoughts on the role that Asia will play in the global blockchain ecosystem?
Well, I think one of the broader observations that I've seen and I think continue to play out, especially in the current COVID-19 pandemic situation, is that we see industries, governments, really across the world, continuously to looking at ways in terms of how they can optimize the movement of goods, data, and really the exchange of value across the global supply chain. And Asia is really at the heart of many of these supply chains, whether on the consuming side or on the producing side. Asia has been a really key part of this global supply chain. And with the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting impact and changes to the economy, I think one of the key things that's really come up very strongly and apparently is the importance of digitization of trade and looking at new ways of working. And that has become a top priority in a lot of economies, a lot of countries, and it touches, I think, the very heart of Asia today. Right, a lot of economies in Asia today are dependent on some of the export-driven areas. For example, in the area of food, for example, places like Thailand, for example. One of the studies that was done by Capricorn Research, for example, states that the food and beverage exports worth about $26 to $27 billion. And for it to continue to grow, one of the key things that's important to look at is number one, the aspect around transparency and quality of some of these goods that are actually exported out from countries like Thailand, but more broadly across the ecosystem itself. And if you look at places like Singapore, for example, a lot of focus is around things like being self-sufficient, sustainability, and that probably could be extended to other parts of Asia as well. And where blockchain comes to play very strongly in some of these markets and economies is how can we leverage the idea of blockchain to introduce greater transparency in some of these areas, how we can provide an avenue for less of a wastage of the food supply chain, how we can provide better visibility on the supply chain side. So one of the efforts that we've been working on is this project called IBM Food Trust, which really looks at enabling a digital, essentially what I would term as a digital information platform that connects various parts of the supply chain together. And that involves basically connecting players in Asia to other participants around the world, be it in North America, be it to Europe, but really touching the value chain ranging from the farmers to the producers to the retailers at both ends of the supply chain. Other examples that I can think of, right, stretching beyond the goods itself or the food example that we spoke about. If you look at the supply chain that I kind of mentioned earlier on, the other thing that I think is worth mentioning, especially in places like Singapore, for example, which is at a very heart of the global trade network, right? A very key aspect of the global trade network. I think one of the key things is how do we eradicate as much as possible this the notion of friction that exists today in the supply chain, right? Whether it's dealing with customs paperwork, whether it's looking at things like cross-border payments or any other barriers to trade. And that becomes even more important, as I mentioned earlier on, with the COVID-19 pandemic. How can we enable stronger digitalization of the existing trade ecosystem? So one of the efforts that we've looked at is looking at TradeLens, which is a joint development effort between IBM as well as MERS to establish an open and neutral industry platform underpinned by blockchain technology that really connects the different players in the global shipping industry. So we're heartened really by the contributions and efforts by major players in the supply chain, and in terms of how this platform comes about, right? So ranging from ports, terminals, customs authorities, shippers, and ocean carriers, a significant number of these participants in this TradeLens platform are actually based in Asia itself, really reinforcing the role that Asia plays, right? Within Asia itself, where blockchain could contribute, but also a reminder that Asia is a critical part of the global ecosystem, not just from a blockchain perspective, but also from a trade, from a supply, and potentially from a finance aspect as well. So I think these are some of the things that come to mind as I look at the where Asia sits in the global ecosystem. But more importantly, I think with the current COVID-19 pandemic, I think that reinforces the importance that economies, countries, especially in Asia, needs to look at how they can improve, how they collaborate, work with each other, ultimately survive and be relevant in the new market and economy.
Great. So yeah, Alan spoke a lot about the role of Asia to the world and the various initiatives that you guys are working on at IBM itself. Like Eric, you have been working on various cross-border initiatives, including talent engagement. Can you share some thoughts on inter-Asia activities that you are seeing that is helping to accelerate the adoption of blockchain technology across the region itself?
So let me start from a little bit of the WeBank's background. So WeBank started in 2014, and then 2015 we actually see the potential of blockchain, and then we actually have our own blockchain ledger, physical beacons, and then we even open sourced it at that time. 2016 we actually use it in production. You can imagine having a blockchain in production in China is actually quite challenging. So we actually have a syndicated loans working with other banks. So this really wouldn't happen if we didn't have support from the regulators. So we were very transparent, and then we even helped the regulators to create tools to monitor transactions. But if we look at Asia at that time, like 2016, right, a lot of focus were still on Bitcoin. So making collaborative business quite hard at that moment. People love blockchain when they think of Bitcoin, right? But those that really hates it, they think that is kind of a scam at the same time. So it's really hard to kind of talk about blockchain at that moment. But in the past, like 1 to 2 years, we do see a shift that starts from like investment now on how do we use blockchain as like a technology where we can build business on top of it. So we actually worked with Macau in 2018 because they have a vision of a smart city, and then we're actually helping them to build the infrastructure, which is based on our open source identity. It's actually a decentralized identifier on blockchain. So this wouldn't really happen if we don't have great collaboration on the government side. So if we look at like during the pandemics, identity actually gives some lights to the recent release health systems, which allows Macau and as well as Guangdong to actually mutually recognize the QR code and then passes data from one area to another. So take, for example, if you take a lab test in Macau, and then if you go to Singapore, Singapore can actually validate the test results, and because it's actually recorded on blockchain. What's the important thing I see is actually, we need to have the regulatory supports in the governments as well as the student ecosystem. So that's why we actually work with Open Notes, and then we actually went into Singapore, and then we joined a few universities to actually give kind of blockchain courses on physical beacons, as well as some successful stories within China, because there's lots of cross-border potential solutions that can happen, but when you actually go to the regulator or government side, it's going to be a big wall for them. So we need to actually put more educations, as well as explaining the the benefit of blockchain, not just on the investment side.
That's really interesting. Thanks for sharing. So I think after we listen to two leading corporates speak about the efforts of them driving in the blockchain ecosystem, maybe now it's time for us to shift it a little onto the role of government. So one key topic that has always been brought up in blockchain discussion is the need for governments and organizations to collaborate. Veronica, you have been driving various industry development efforts in Singapore to support the growth of the ecosystem. How do you think this supportive role of governments will evolve moving forward with a fast-changing blockchain landscape?
So this is a very apt question. I was listening to what Eric shared about how it's important to have regulator support in order for them to develop and advance in their own journey. So actually, if you look at the role of government from different countries, there probably you still do see some variances from country to country. There are countries who have a very rich history where there's a very strong industry-led innovation. In these countries, you may see that the governments may not necessarily play a very active role. However, increasingly, we do see that strong government support is actually coming in many countries to drive blockchain. Especially in the past 2 years, 3 years, we have seen quite a few countries actually actively driving blockchain strategies. Based on what I recall, some of you that have been in this space for much longer, I recall the earlier governments could probably be in Dubai, where they were one of the first to come up with a blockchain strategy all the way in 2016. And I think since then they have published something like a completion or success achievement report. That was literally quite a few years ago, about 5 years. And now in the last 2 years, 2019, 2020, you do see quite a lot of activities. In China, for example, President Xi made a speech about the importance of the blockchain technology late last year. Then between late last year and early this year, Germany, Australia, and India all have published blockchain strategy and roadmap documents to talk about their role in innovating and driving this ecosystem forward. So if you look at the trend the past 5 years, I think increasingly governments are starting to pay attention to and put emphasis on it. And perhaps it also makes sense because in the past 5 years, the technology has been advancing and seen quite a few applications by different corporates. As the networks become increasingly large and participants become participating across borders, there are some macro issues that tend to be cross-border. For example, data protection, differences in jurisdiction across different countries and geographical boundaries. And this is probably also an important place for governments to start talking to each other to actually make sure that some of these G2G issues can also be addressed at the macro level. So I think increasingly you do see governments paying attention and wanting to also be a part of the conversation and driving this role together with the private sector.
So Veronica shed some light on her perspective of the future, and I think that's really interesting. Like coming from the corporate perspective, what's your thoughts, Alan, on the role that government can play to support organizations, both big and small, across Asia?
I think the governments really play a very critical role in making this happen and enabling success. I see from a few aspects. One, I think some of the trends that we see governments being involved in driving industry-wide experimentations, coming up with thought leadership paper. We see that in places like Singapore with various experimentation that was done around Project Ubin, for example. We see efforts in places like in Hong Kong, for example, where the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the HKMA, was actively involved in the trade finance platform involving the different banks. They have since launched eTrade Connect and continue to basically expand on that. In fact, one of the efforts that we are involved in, We.Trade, which is a trade finance platform, which started originally in Europe. There was a recent project that looks at basically the connectivity between the East, in that sense, represented by the eTrade Connect platform, as well as connectivity to WeTrade. So really at the start of global efforts to connect basically different networks. And that's an example where a government body really helps to drive some of those experimentation and some of the thought leadership efforts as well. The other thing is around, I think, establishing national blockchain infrastructure. And we've seen how some of the economist industries have taken active positions to establish a common foundation in which some of the experimentations and some of the use cases could actually come in, right? Really removing the friction that exists in terms of incubating and starting out use cases. The third aspects, I think, where government and the rest of the ecosystem can really play a role is around helping to drive standards, fostering standards, understanding the technology and adoption. And one of the great examples I think we see is some of the efforts around what IMDA is doing through the efforts of Open Notes and Tribe, establishing a platform where I think different parts of the ecosystems, corporate startups, really come together and gain a better understanding of blockchain as a technology, improving skills that are available in the market, but also creating a venue, I would say, for the interactions and the participation between different parts of the supply, the different parts of the ecosystem. I think that plays a very critical role if we want this to succeed, right? Of course, the other aspects around regulations, the other aspects around providing the infrastructure that supports the invention and innovation of technology, that's also very, very key. But I think we need to consider as well the role that the government plays in driving some of the innovation efforts and bringing industry together. I think that's a very a key role, perhaps understated in some of these areas. But I think we need to recognize and really appreciate some of the efforts on that front as well.
I think that's really very interesting sharing that you did mention. And I think with that, I'll go back to Veronica first. So, I mean, IMDA has been driving a lot of blockchain-related initiative on ground, including the blockchain challenge itself. And I think Veronica herself has been working with different governments across the world, talking about collaboration, and have also been working with many companies across Asia. They've seen, they've researched, and they've done a lot of developments, industry developments efforts in Singapore. So, Veronica, what do you think it takes for new companies to succeed in a fast evolving blockchain landscape in Asia?
So firstly, for any new company, not necessarily just a blockchain company, the typical considerations for them to be able to grow quickly and to grow well would be typical things like the commercial operating model, their unique value proposition of their technology, the ability to attract investments and to attract good talent. But these are fairly generic considerations. I think specific to blockchain, probably one key thing is the ability for the company to build a trusted reputation. Now, if you think about it, blockchain technology, the whole idea about the technology is that it does away with the middleman, the trusted people and the institutions that form the intermediary, to placing the trust in the technology. And if you're the company behind this technology, either developing it or operating it for your customers, for example, then to a certain extent, you tend to have to play a certain level of trust. And it probably depends on the details from company to company, what the product offering is. But general ways would be maybe the governance of how you run the network, the parity and equal treatment of the members participating. Others could be the technology governance, how do new product features or technology upgrades and enhancements get introduced. Others could be even right down to code implementation level, when you say that the solution does what it does it really do what it does or not? So these are a couple of, I think, quite important considerations specific to a blockchain company in order to be able to gain a certain reputation and therefore be able to be trusted, to be the ones operating the solution, where you shift the trust away from the people and the institutions to the technology itself.
Great. And for the last question, before we wrap up this panel itself, what are the exciting developments within Asia that you hope to see within the next 3 to 5 years for Eric?
So I think blockchain itself is actually moving very quickly. So the past few years, right? I think a lot of focus has been changed. There's still a lot of talks on cross-border payments where central banks are involved. So I do actually want to see that commercialized within the next few years, because this will actually benefit everyone in the public. So you can imagine that I can transfer some money to my friends in US or Singapore, and then the actual movement could be instantly, and then the charge would be actually quite low or even nothing, right? That's the ideal. And then, I mean, if you look at besides money related, right, I do want to see the decentralized identifier, which is actually quite a hot topic in W3C area, is actually being commercialized as well. Because if you imagine that in the next few years, right, there's going to be a lot of like IoTs coming in. You can imagine that each of these devices would have its own identity in a blockchain, and then the owner of the device can actually provide consent to just share these data. At the end of the day, right, you have lots of these kind of devices kind of collecting data as well as exchanging data. So this will be where the blockchain will be one of the key technology in the space.
Okay, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have to cut the panel now as we're running out of time, but would definitely love to hear more insights from you guys next time. And I think with that, once again, thank you so much for taking time out to join us for this panel this afternoon itself. And we look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you.